Maybe can I ask, just a matter of interest, can everybody in the chat box, the participants list, can I just have an indication of how many of you actually work with open education resources on a regular basis? If you can just raise your hand in the box. Right, I don't see any hands started. Yes, Ingrid, yes, good. All right, and just an indication, how many of you actually know about Creative Commons? If you can just raise your hand. All right, Paul, I think that gives you a very good idea of the audience.
That's useful to know. I'll give a little bit more information then, and as we go through, if I've left anything out or not been clear enough, then we can go through more discussion at the end of it.
Thank you. Paul, just how much do you know about LIASA?
Very little, actually.
All right, maybe just a quick introduction. LIASA is the Library and Information Association of South Africa. LIASA has got professional body status, therefore we register as professional librarians. And its intention is to ensure that there's a cohesion in terms of understanding and knowledge in the industry. And we come from different sectors. Some of us are academic librarians, some are public librarians, some are special librarians. And then there's also, obviously within those spheres, there's a specific focus in certain areas like interlibrary loans or technical services or things like that. So the background of, and I see a lot of these names that I know, and I also know that backgrounds are fairly different in many ways, what they focus on. But you are speaking to librarians, and they're a very nice bunch. One of my favorite groups of people, and hopefully there's some archivists in here as well. We don't, the archivists, they have a separate, Lee, you just became the host. I'm not sure how you got that right, but that's interesting. The archivists have a separate body that they belong to, but we would like to bring the two together because of very similar interests and very similar means of doing things, especially in a digital environment. So yes, colleagues, I'm going to start. It's 9:04. And just to give you a short introduction to Paul, Paul West is an independent consultant in the fields of ICT, education, open education resources, open learning, knowledge management, and project management. So you can understand immediately from his background, there's a vast and very solid background when it comes to educational resources. And Paul is also the lead, chapter lead in the South African Creative Commons. That means Paul leads the coordination and management of the chapter, both in terms of governance and activities, and serve as the main point of contact for Creative Commons headquarters, which is International Creative Commons entity. There's a lot of other things. I'm not going to go through the whole, Paul. Is there anything specifically you would like to mention? Please go ahead. But just to tell the audience that we are on the most incredible hands today, and we will most probably pepper you with questions. If you have any questions, please put it into the chat box. Anna-Marie and I will, most probably Ingrid as well, will check and make sure that all those questions are answered. And also please note that the slides and anything else will be made available afterwards under Creative Commons license, as it should be. Thanks. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the short introduction to LIASA as well. I popped into the chat window a link to a thing called the African Digital Library. So this is some of my contact with library services. In 1999, I bumped into people in the US, which was then called Net Library. Came back to South Africa, found some money, and set up an online library called the African Digital Library. It is still hosted. It's free of charge to anybody living in Africa. And books are mostly sponsored by UNISA, as far as I know. And there's quite a lot of books in there. So it might not have what you want, but it is a free resource to students who are working online. The registration process is a lot easier these days. So that's one of my contact points with library services. I'm a generalist. I'm not a specialist, a librarian by any means, although I did set up that particular library. There was a lot of help from other people to do that, and it's hosted by EBSCO host. I'm going to switch on some slides now. So I'm just going to bring up a PowerPoint window, and then I'm going to put on a presentation. Van, could you confirm that you can see that full screen on your machine?
Yes, I can.
Great. I'm going to move my little window of pictures to the side. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to everybody for joining today. I hope it's going to be a useful session to you. I've got to do something here. There we go. I'll start by stating the unnecessary. One of the things I noticed about Creative Commons is it has a code of conduct, code of ethics. And so they're very focused on making sure that it's an harassment-free experience and all that sort of thing. It's just something I really liked, especially having worked a lot in this country, and we seem to have quite a few problems. So I like to put this up at the beginning of any presentation that I make related to Creative Commons. It's one of the things that I like. Very important in this presentation today, in any of the discussion, you cannot construe anything that I say as legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a generalist. I've done the certificate course, and congratulations to Vaynard also for having finished the certificate course now. We've both got top marks in this thing, so we know the topic pretty well, but we're not a lawyer, so we cannot give you legal advice on something. We can certainly have a useful discussion, I think, today. And I think at the end of today, we'll all know a little bit more about open licensing, and that's important to us. The story of open education resources, often you'll hear, starts in 2002, when UNESCO made a decision. And that's actually not true. It didn't start in 2002, and UNESCO didn't make a decision. It started well before this. So I'm going to track through this to start with, and then we'll go into the licenses a little bit more. So on the top left-hand side, you'll see copyright, but sharing anyway. And you'll know that in the past, decades in the past, we've all created works, or we've all borrowed works from people, and we've just shared them. We've copied material. And if you can point to a student who hasn't copied copyrighted material, I'd be very surprised that you can actually do that truthfully. So we've been copying materials in one way or another for a very long time. They weren't open, but they were copied. The name David Wiley I put into this because he's central to where we are today. David Wiley created the first open license in 1998. So he actually predates Creative Commons as well, and is a great supporter of Creative Commons today. An organization that's critically important to this movement and why we are here now is the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. This foundation sponsored the origins of the OER movement. I was with the Commonwealth of Learning in Vancouver in the early 2000s. I met with the Hewlett Foundation. I know exactly when they decided to sponsor the Creative Commons itself. So Creative Commons had a certain history. We're going to touch on that. And then the Hewlett Foundation stepped in with some of the first substantive funding. And the Hewlett Foundation has put in hundreds of millions of US dollars to supporting the growth of this OER foundation. So if anybody in the world can be attributed to the creation of this foundation, it's Kathy Casserly and Michael Marshall Smith at the Hewlett Foundation. They both left there a long time ago, and David Wiley. Those are three of the names that would pop up very significantly in the creation of this movement. There's another strand of this. So that first strand is the education world. And we were sharing content, as I say, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s already, but we weren't calling it anything specific. The open source world comes up as well because they were creating software in the decades before. And things like the Free Software Foundation, the GNU project, the development of Linux, those are all part of that world. and names like Richard Stallman and Linus Torvalds. And Linus was, the name was converted to being Linux. Those names all come up in the open source world. So that was happening through the 80s and 90s. Then finally, this strand that we learn in the Creative Commons course, certificate course, we must mention that later, its origin is in what's termed the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. And I'm going to come back to that. And of course, the name Lawrence Lessig comes up, and he is a lawyer. He's in the US, and he created the Creative Commons side of it. So those are the three legs that I'm aware of. What happened then in 2002-ish was an IIP discussion. The person I remember there was Susan D'Antoni. She's a Canadian, French and English-speaking Canadian, working in Paris, working for the IIEP at the time. And she was running an online discussion. And during these online discussions, you can imagine early 2000s, this was not Zoom at that stage, this was an email discussion. And all of a sudden, one day I was sitting in Vancouver and people were hopping up and down saying, we've now got a name. This is called OER in future. And so that's when this name suddenly popped up. It was in a fairly casual discussion run by email. A bunch of geeks around the world decided to use that name. That was 2002. Jump forward 5 years, 2007. I found myself in Cape Town at a meeting being held at the Shuttleworth Foundation offices. And that was where we all stood in a line, and a physical line across a long meeting room. Where at the one end of the room were people like Jimmy Wales, who started the Wikipedia. And he said everything should be free and don't even bother with attribution. And at the other extreme end of the room, people were physically standing there saying we should have a no derivatives option on this. I was probably somewhere in the middle saying we should think about this and decide what license we need for what. But the Cape Town Declaration, you can still find it online and you can still sign it. I was certainly one of the earlier signatures on behalf of the Commonwealth of Learning because I was attending on their behalf. Jump forward another 5 years, 2012, Sir John Daniel went to Paris with Stemenka Uvelik-Trumbik, who was working at, Sir John was at Commonwealth of Learning as the president and CEO. Stemenka was working at UNESCO, and they organized the first world conference on this matter. And so that you'll find online the 2012 declaration. If you jump forward quite a lot of years again, about another 5 years, you'll find that Commonwealth of Learning and UNESCO were doing consultations around the world, trying to get this a little bit more formalized. I was very fortunate. I was able to attend the meeting for Europe that was held in Malta, but there were meetings held around the world. And finally, in 2019, a recommendation was approved by UNESCO. This is a recommendation, it's not a rule, it's not a law, but it encourages governments to do something. There's a little bit of contention there as well. I'm going to touch on that, but I'm going to try to not give too much confusion to it. Just another little diagram to try to give you the scale of things. Around 94, we were talking about learning objects, and still into the 2000s, we were still talking about learning objects. That's part of this picture. David Wiley, I mentioned, open content was the term he used. Larry Lessig got started in 2001, published his licenses in 2002. MIT started to release all their course material. That was quite a story at the time. The MIT lecturers had a hernia about this because they were classroom notes. They weren't distance education notes. They weren't online learning at that stage. They were classroom notes. And they had, of course, like anybody else, copied material from everywhere. So the Vice Chancellor gave them a length of time and they had to release the material. So that meant that the MIT lecturers had to rewrite a lot of their own materials. It was quite a thing for them. About the same time, the Open University in the UK were building up theirs, and I can't think of the names quickly enough. Can't think of the names quite quickly enough, but there were two people involved from the Open University who were really pushing this forward as well. And there you'll see I mentioned the Cape Town Declaration and another conference by the OER Foundation That's run by Wayne McIntosh, an ex-South African now living in Dunedin in New Zealand. And this drawing ends at the 2012 Paris Declaration. And across the bottom, you'll see I recognize again the Hewlett Foundation, which really got this all started. It was their money that got this started. Going back to Creative Commons, and this is part of what comes from the course material in the Creative Commons certificate. The copyright laws that most of us are using, especially South Africa, because our laws are just so old in this regard, are vested in the world of print materials. It doesn't take into account what we need to take into account for a digital world. We've reduced the cost of printing materials down to almost nothing by making it digital. So long as you read the material on a device, you don't have a problem of cost of duplication anymore. Not for most of us. I understand there are issues with data costs, but that is minimal compared to the printing costs. So we can share on an unprecedented scale. This creates tension between those of us living in the digital world saying, I want this thing free, and those people living in the 400-year-old print world who say, I want you to pay me lots of money to print this thing for you. I don't need the printed copy. I'd rather have the digital copy. I just don't read on paper anymore. So that's me, and I recognize that there are different people, and different people need different strokes. So point of this is we want to be able to share. We've got the technologies to share now. Why don't we do this? Going back to the Creative Commons formation, this Mickey Mouse Protection Act, so-called, is actually the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. This is where the US, and the credit for this is given to the Disney World Empire, that they wanted the copyright extended from 50 years past the death of the creator to 70 years. And there was talk about the US trying to push this higher as well. So this is what was happening. And Lawrence Lessig took the government to court, but unfortunately, he lost the case. And we kept the copyright. We've got the 70 years, and we've got a whole lot of issues about that with people trying to be very protective over their copyright. The non-profit Creative Commons was created in 2001. Its licenses were in 2002. I can tell you after that, I took up the licenses and I started running workshops for Commonwealth of Learning around the Commonwealth countries of the world. This is a set of licenses. There are 6 licenses and there are 2 extra logos. And I'm going to keep coming back to this. So remember, it's 6 licenses and 2 logos that are in use here. Although this was started in the US, San Francisco area, it is worldwide. The licenses that we're using today were developed by a team of people from around the world, including a well-known lawyer in South Africa. That's Tobias Schoenbetter, Tobias Schoenbetter, as he's known these days. The staff of Creative Commons are around the world as well. There's no single central head office for Creative Commons anymore. I think there was for a while, but it shut down. And so their staff are really all over, and it can be quite awkward having meetings sometimes because you've got to then have it in our evenings or sometime in the morning. It is really an international organization. The chapter in South Africa is not even a registered body, it's a group of interested people, and personally as the chapter lead, I'd hope to keep it that way for as long as possible. So it has no bank account or anything like that either. The licenses for those of us who would like to share knowledge. Typical big users, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that's in New York, the European, that word there, the Commonwealth of Learning, UNESCO, World Bank, Siavulas in Cape Town. Many organizations use the materials, under Creative Commons licenses, and I'm going to show you a bit of the scale of that in a few minutes. I've told you about Kathy Cassidy and Mike Smith. I've mentioned that this is a growing large movement. There are lots of activists, including a lot of librarians around the world, and it affects you quite a lot, especially when you want to make compilations for academics or for students. Policymakers, researchers, creators all around the world. I'd encourage you to join the Creative Commons Global Network. Links for this will be at the end of the presentation and will be in the PDF that you can download. And there are many related organizations. If you go to Wikipedia, Mozilla, WikiEducator, many organizations use these licenses. So if you have any doubts about are these the right ones, we're going to cover that well today. In the 15+ years that Creative Commons has been around, it now is used on over 1.6 billion resources or works, and it's on more than 9 million websites. This is the global standard. Its focus is on being open, on encouraging collaboration, and on sharing the creativity that we've got around the world. We'll go into the detail on them shortly. So anybody can use a Creative Commons license. The one thing you cannot change is the contents of a license. The license itself, the legal document, is not it's shared free of charge, but it's not an adaptable resource. It is as it is, because that creates the standardization around the world. So the internet has made global distribution and sharing of copyrightable works possible with a click of a button. This is great, and it also creates challenges for us. In the education world, we focus on the 5 R's, and the name you'll find behind this is David Wiley. So I give him credit for this. You can retain, revise, remix, reuse, and redistribute. And this is important to make note of. You'll be able to get these slides so you can get the details. And if you look in the bottom right, you'll see a URL as well for where to find more information. Retain is important because when you download the resource, you need to be able to keep it on your own computer. You need to be able to keep it on your server, and you need to be able to serve it up to other people. So that right to retain is an important one. That's where there's a bit of tension with the UNESCO recommendation, because it no longer carries the word retain in it. It just says access, and that could be a problem. So make sure that you keep in your mind, you need to be able to retain, and with a Creative Commons license, you can retain. You must be able to revise the work. That is, you can edit it, you can adapt it, you can make copies of it, you can correct it, you can mix it with other stuff. So you can remix, you can take the material that you download, you can add to it, you can take another piece of material, and you can mix them together. We're going to get to a table which will help me to show you the kind of issues with remixing. Reuse, you must be able to reuse it and share it with anybody for it to be an open education resource, and you must be able to redistribute it yourself. You should not have to, for example, go back to somebody else's server and say, please, will you reshare this for me? You can, but you must be able to do it yourself as well, from your machine, from your Google account, or Office 365 account, or whatever. You must be able to have those rights. In this 2019 UNESCO recommendation, it says to create, access, reuse, adapt, and redistribute. So most of that is the same. The only part that's different is to access. And just be wary of that one. That's something to watch out for. You need more than just access, because access means I will keep it on my server, and every time you want it, I will give you access to my server. It doesn't say you can redistribute it from your server. I could write into the finer lines that I could want you to redistribute it from my server, and that's not good enough for an OER. UNESCO supports the creation of policies on OER that we definitely need to do, and I'm going to give you a guidance note on that later. Encourage inclusive and equitable quality OER. We're not doing OER for sharing rubbish materials, we're doing it for quality material. And the general understanding of that is if you go back to the Wikipedia model, you'll find that a Wikipedia article improves in quality and accuracy over time. If you go to a Wikipedia article and you put in an error, you'll probably find in hours or days, depending on how active that page is, that somebody will correct your error. I don't encourage you to put in any errors into Wikipedia. It is the biggest and most accurate encyclopedia in the world, so it's very necessary for all of us. Nurturing the creation of sustainability models. We all need to earn a living somehow, so we do need to find our sustainability models. They may not look the same as in the past. So the publishers stick in a certain kind of model and they're having some difficulties, but many publishers are moving to new models as well. Promotion and reinforcement of international cooperation in OER. Initially, when the Hewlett Foundation was funding universities, one of the critiques that I gave them was, you need to fund the US university and the university in an African country to the same degree. Don't give the one 95% and the other one 5%, and you know who gets which. It needs to be a much more equitable relationship. And so they did change in those years, and I think other people have been changing as well. At the bottom of the slide, you'll find 2 links. Those are possibly useful when you do go through the PDF. The impact of technical choices. This is the ALMS framework. When you create and you share resources, these are points to think about. If I take a resource and I upload it to the internet, and that resource is in a file format that requires you to go and spend 20,000 Rand on an app to be able to edit it, can I really call it editable? Or do I need to convert it to another format? Some people will tell you that it needs to be in an open source tool, like OpenOffice rather than MS Word or MS Office. You decide how far you want to go with that, but just something to think about. If you put something out in a format that can only be read by an app that costs a fortune, are you really making it available? Or does the person have to create it from scratch before they can start editing it? The level of expertise required. Does it need another 6-month course to be able to use this tool? It's an issue, and what would one pay for that as well? That's time and money. Meaningfully editable. Is this a scanned graphic that I can actually do nothing with when I download it? Or is it a graphic that I could do something with? And self-sourced, is it one of the usual formats, or is it some cockeyed format that nobody knows about anyway? So really you're trying to get the person to come back to you. These are just some things to think about on the technical side of it. When we make available a report, we would typically make it available in a PDF format because you can read it, you can print it if you want to print still. It would be nice if you make it available as an ebook reader, like an EPUB or a Mobi format, because that can scale the text better. But are we also making it available in the formats that people could edit? Could we also take the Word version, all the graphics, zip them up and put them into a folder called these are the underlying digital assets, and you're welcome to take these and edit them so if you wish. That would be nice. We don't always have time for it, but it would be nice if we can share the real underlying digital assets as well. When you want to select a license, I've included a picture on the screen now of the new license chooser. This is in beta form. At the bottom right, you'll see a link that says Chooser Beta. This one is available. The one on the main website is still the traditional, slightly older one. They're just as easy, I think, to use, but this is where you will select which license you want to use, and it helps you through the questions that you need to go through. The licenses, of the 6 licenses, there are 3 formats of this license. There's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek here, so please bear with me. There's the legal code. This is the 7-page or 10-page 8-point font that none of us normally read. And this is called the lawyer readable version because only lawyers normally read it. Most of us don't read it. The second one is the short version, the one with the little circles and the icons. And this one's called the human readable version. It's for most of the rest of us who want to read it and get a short idea, quick idea of what this thing is. If you really want to understand it, you do need to go back to the lawyer readable version. And if you don't understand that, you need to ask somebody questions. The last one, the machine readable, this is the underlying code that computers can read. So neither the lawyers or the humans read this stuff, but at least it's there for the programmers and the computers to read. So those are the 3 different versions of the licenses. They're called 3-layer design. So every one of the 6 licenses has these 3 versions. Now I'm going to go through the 6 licenses. And I hope at the end of this slide, you'll have a general idea of how these things work, and you'll be able to be in a slightly better position to make some choices. And it's all in this slide, and there are other slides you'll find online. If you need more of this, then Bainant or I could help you with this. So at the top of it, this is not a license, this is public domain. It's sometimes called CC0. CC0 is an icon, it's not a license. So if something is truly public domain, if you are creating something and you want to put it in the public domain, but you want to put a CC label on it, you would use a CC0 label. And that is also the public domain. If it comes from the public domain, you would probably use the one in that diagram at the top. So it's a CC0 license, no rights reserved, no necessity for attributing to anybody. It is fully in the public domain. And remember that things enter the public domain typically 50 or 70 years after the death of the originator, or they've been given to the public domain from the start. You can take something, you can create a page of text, you can publish it on the internet, you can put a CC0 or a public domain notice on it, and it's immediately out there. Anybody can use it without attributing it to you. The first of the CC licenses is the second icon down. It is, I think you might see my cursor, it is a CC BY. The BY originally was by attribution. It is now with attribution. So if I write a piece of material, a work, and I want to publish it on the internet, and all I want you to do is to say, the original of this was created by Paul West. That's the logo that I would use. I would put that onto it. I would put a link to the actual license code, to the license code, the lawyer readable one. And I'd say, you're welcome to use this. I'm giving you permission. You don't have to come and ask me. You can go ahead and use it, and you can just put on there that the original was created by Paul West, and any additions and changes you are then accountable for. So you should be able to identify in it which is which. Because you're not attributing my name to a blank piece of material, a bunch of material that possibly you've done a whole lot of writing and you want that attribution as well. If a third person comes along and downloads your version, they would need to attribute both me and then you, and then they would add their name to it. So this attribution list could get longer and longer. And it's very useful if, for example, I write a piece of study material that's very suited to the winter rain conditions in the Western Cape. And then somebody in Richards Bay wants to use that material, but they have summer rain. So they need to customize the material for their conditions. They would attribute the first author with the Western Cape. They would make their customizations to the material, and they would add their name to it. And the same would go on. The third one down is a by SA. So this is with attribution and share alike. The by attribution is the same as the one before. The additional restriction, as it's called, is the share alike. What I'm saying to you here is I've created this material. I'm giving it to you to update, to edit, to do what you like with, but I'm also asking you to share it on. So once you've created your new reworked piece of material, please will you share it with the rest of the world again? Because by doing that, I'm trying to increase the usage of the effort that I put into this material. I'm not asking for money for it. I'm just saying, here's a piece of material. I think it's useful, and I think the world might benefit from it. And I'm saying to you, when you update this material, please also share this with the world so that more people can find it useful. And that would roll on and create more and more works. Those licenses there are the most usual licenses used in OER, the BY and the BY SA. So those are probably the ones that you will work with if you publish any OER material. The next one I'm going to raise, the next restriction, is this NC clause. This is one of, I'd say it's the second most contentious issue here. The NC is non-commercial, and I need to go through this a little bit more. In the 2000s, when I was doing those workshops I mentioned earlier for Commonwealth of Learning, this was a heated issue, and it came up in the 2007 Cape Town Declaration meeting. Remember I mentioned that people were standing at one extreme of the room saying everything must be free, and people were standing at the other end of the room saying, I need to make money out of this. The non-commercial restriction says to you, you can use material, you can share the material, you can customize material and then share it, but you may not profit from it. Now, unfortunately, in the CC licenses, they've never quite defined NC because their choice was to let the law of precedent in the courts define this. I thought that was a problem in the 2000s when I was doing this. I spoke to Creative Commons. They told me their position. The same people are still in place, by the way. The legal counsel is still there. And so what I did with Cole was I gathered a lot of lawyers together from various countries. The first meeting was in Johannesburg, and the second meeting was in London in the UK. And we wrote up a 1.5-page document which gave a short description of what this NC clause should mean in all legal jurisdictions around the world. And we tested it with, there was one attorney general and there were many lawyers from different countries. And the general consensus, and it seems to have held, is that non-commercial does not prevent you from cost recovery. So if you are going to, the easiest example is to use a print example. So if I've made a work, a PDF, you print this work, and then you print 10 copies and you hand out the 10 copies to students. And you say to them, students, I can't afford to sponsor this, I need you to pay me back for my copies. That's not profiting from it, that is cost recovery. If let's say you have to print 10,000 copies for your students, and you had to employ somebody to stand in front of the printer while it was printing, you can also charge the students for the person's time that's standing there. You're still not profiting from it, you are doing cost recovery. So within the non-commercial, you are allowed to do cost recovery, but you're not allowed to do profiting. Now, it is not determined by the kind of organization. For example, a for-profit educational institution can use non-commercial materials. What they would have to do is they will have to ring fence the financing of where they're using it, so that if anybody wants to come and question them, they need to be able to show that they didn't, that the turnover or the cost recovery on that material did not contribute to the profit of that private organization. And the same goes for a non-profit organization as well. Then the non-profit organization may not declare profits, but it pays out a lot of money, including salaries. So it should also be able to show that this was cost recovery and not the equivalent of profit going to cross-subsidize something else. That would also be a problem. This does not stop you from sending this material to a printing company, like in this country, a Postnet. You could give it to a Postnet, ask them to print it, and they print it, and they charge you a certain amount of money. To you, that is still a non-commercial activity. That is cost recovery for you. You would need to pass that at cost on. So I hope that clarifies the non-commercial clause or restriction. That one is a bit of a contentious one. Many organizations do use it. Some people hate it. And so you've got to position yourself as to where you are going to be, whether you use it or not. Yes.
If I may, I just want to ask a question, which I think some of the librarians might be asking is, if you make available a open education resource under this specific license, and the creator gets approached by, for argument's sake, a publisher, and they want to take a portion of this into a book they want to sell, what would be the consequences and what would be the process?
That is now a legal question, I think, and one would have to approach a lawyer to check that, because that chapter would have to be clearly marked as an OER, and they could not profit from that chapter. So, if it carries an NC clause. If it doesn't have the NC on, you can quite comfortably give it to the publisher and they can use it. I think this also touches on another important point, is that A Creative Commons license is irrevocable. You cannot cancel it. So if you take your material, you publish it on the internet with a CC license, and then the publisher comes to get your copy, that copy will carry that original CC license. So until such time as you update it to such an extent that you have a new work, you cannot give it a different license. The publisher has to carry the same license forward. The non-commercial issue in that one is a little bit fine-tuned, and somehow they would have to ring-fence that chapter and mark it that you can comfortably copy that chapter out of the book, and that chapter is not contributing to the company's profits. That's my interpretation as a lay person. Thanks, Reinhard. I'm going to carry on with this. The next one down, there's a by NC We're just adding more restrictions onto it. Then we come to the ND, the no derivatives. This means that I create this work, I put it on the internet, and I say to you, you're welcome to download it. With that one, remember in that particular block, there's no non-commercial, so you can sell it at a profit if you want, or non-profit. You can share it as you like, but you may not change it. In the open education resources world, you'll find that that will be the most heated debate of all. Many people say to you, then it's not an OER. But let's just think about it for a moment. If I write a chapter and I happen to be a surgeon and I'm writing up a procedure on surgery and my name is on this as an attribution, I might be very concerned, or it's the same for a case of a lawyer. I might be concerned if it was adapted and this new procedure didn't do what I expected it to do, and then it caused damage, it caused death or injury or something else. It may be a problem to me. So keeping an open mind to this, I'd like to recognize that there's a good use for an ND, that there are appropriate uses for it, but it does cause difficulties. There are some changes that you can make even to an ND material. If I receive an ND piece of material from somebody and I find some spelling mistakes in it, I can still fix them. If I need to prepare the material in Braille for a blind student, I can still make that conversion. Those conversions are still accepted within the CC license, but you may not change the work. What I might do is I might take your ND work and I might put it into an appendix and say in my main works where I'm writing, I'd say refer to Appendix 1 where there is the ND work and read the third paragraph on this page. That I would be more comfortable doing. I think you would check that with the lawyer again, but for that, I'm pretty comfortable with that. So you have the no derivatives work. That's the most restrictive license. Just some little points on the upper right of the slide, you'll see free cultural works. If you look on the internet, you'll find specifically that's it comes from the software world, free cultural works. You give attribution, but you want to share your work as widely as possible. Then down on the red writing, I put special license. This is one of the biggest warnings I need to give today is sometimes I hear the words using an open license. And an open license refers to one of these 6 licenses or the public domain stamps at the top. It doesn't mean writing my own license. And that's a very important one. If I write my own license and you then receive this work from me, how do you know what you can and can't do with it? I could, for example, write a license and put a logo on that says Paul West license by SA. And you would possibly say that, well, it's by SA, it's the same as CC. He must have done the same thing. But what if in my 7 or 14 page of 8-point font legal code, I wrote something different? You download this material and you publish it on your server, and then a month later I send you a cease and desist notice to say to you, I didn't say you could share this from your server, I said you could share it from my server. So that would be in the legal code, and I could then say, well, you know, because you've been sharing from your server, you've broken the license, now you owe me money. Or what if it said share alike? And I came to you a month after you've now issued out 10,000 copies, and I say to you, but I said to you, you can share it provided I approve your customized copy and that you share it from my server. Now in this case, you must pay me 200 Rand per copy that you've shared. There could be all sorts of things written into the fine legal code which you might not recognize if you haven't studied that legal code. So if you have a license that is not a CC whatever, be very careful. It could be a nasty little thing waiting to bite you. Very careful there, be very careful. So just in summary, in a different format, and this might help once you get the PDF as well of this, the by attribution to attribute to the original creator of the work, and that is cumulative. So if you get the 6th generation of it with 6 different authors, you're going to attribute to everybody. That page can get longer. Share alike, it's not South Africa, it's share alike. So share it under the same sort of license that you received it. This can get complicated if you're receiving a work and you're mixing something with different licenses. That's a little bit more complicated. We might not be able to get through all of that today. We'll touch on it a little bit. NC, the non-commercial, it means a non-profit license, essentially in plain English. And no derivatives, you need to use it pretty much as is with a bit of the exclusions that I've mentioned to you. So finally, touching on the public domain. The public domain all works will come into the public domain eventually after the set term or under whatever the country's laws are. And unfortunately, you would need to check it if it's not already licensed, if it's not labeled as public domain from its source, you need to check that carefully as well. As an example of a CC0 license, there's some code there. So you could use that if you want to just release into the open, and you could reference to this. That is the one of the licenses that you could use for that, but this is not a CC license as such. It's more of a stamp that you put onto it. Moving straight on. And these are the 2 typical or 3 typical logos that you would pop onto the works. Quite easy to do that. So now, where do you need to take care? The first one was license proliferation. If I decide, well, I don't want to work with CC, I want to write my own license, that's also called license proliferation. I'm creating yet more licenses, and that means you need to either study up so well that you feel comfortable analyzing the contracts, or you need to contract a lawyer, which is going to cost you a serious amount of money. So where it just says this is an open license as opposed to this is a CC open license, there's a subtle difference there, and that's a warning today. All open education resources use Creative Commons licenses. You can check that in the billions of works that I've mentioned before. You can mix works of different CC licenses. There are tables on the Creative Commons website, and if you need some help with that, I'd suggest approach someone like Vanant or myself or one of the other people in the country who have done the certificate course. To an extent, we can help, not as far as giving you legal guidance goes, but we can give you some help. You do need to look out carefully for the attribution. There is a format for that. I'm going to touch on that in the presentation as well. If in doubt, ask. The first level you could do is to ask one of us. Second level is to ask one of the lawyers in the country. They might take a little longer to get hold of, but they are there. They're very, we've got some very knowledgeable lawyers in the country on this stuff as well. If you just go to a law firm down the street, even if as librarians you've dealt with law firms in the intellectual property arena before, they may not know Creative Commons licenses particularly, and they may go down a different road. So watch out for that. If in doubt with anything, you can always go back to the IP owner. It should be attributed in the works, and you should be able to go back to them to say, I would like to do this with your work. Can I do this? Normally, the CC license avoids you having to do that, but if you're not sure, go back and ask. touching on where we are now, I've mentioned the 1.6 billion works. So this shows the kind of growth that we've gone through from 2006 as counts through to 2017, and now in 2019 it was 1.6 billion already. So that's growing quite fast. I'd suggest when you get back to this, have a look at the Creative Commons license. There's a link to the contact page. The Creative Commons Global Network, this requires you to put in referees as well. So people like Bayonet and myself can help with the referee. And how to select a Creative Commons license. There are 2 links that might be useful to you. The South African chapter, I'd like to encourage everybody to sign up for the chapter. It's just a link. So you'll find it on the website. There's our South African chapter website, and you'll find it there. We have a Facebook page, a LinkedIn page, and a Twitter channel. We've had some issues with the Twitter channel, but we are now using it. So those are our local links. In closing this presentation, I just want to mention one more item. This is a guidance note that I did the first writing, and Tim Unwin worked on it, and then Cable Green, the Director of Education at Creative Commons, worked on it as well. The guidance note is part of a report that's been developed by Tim Unwin in the UK. He put a project together which is sponsored by the EdTech Hub, which is funded by DFID, the Department for International Development in the UK, and the World Bank. So they've paid for it, and they are reviewing the report at the moment. The main report is about using digital technologies to enhance education systems around the world. Because we've all found that we went into this pandemic and found that things that should have been done 10 and 20 and 30 years ago haven't been done yet. And so what are we going to do after this? Once the real panic has settled down, what are we going to do? And this report tries to give guidance on that. At the moment, there are about 13 guidance notes. So I've given you a URL on this one to the latest version that's stored on my own files. That's at the tinyurl.com URL there. Now I'd suggest download this thing and take a look at it. It is a final draft. It's under a Creative Commons license, so it is available for you to use in any way that you want. In this guidance note, you'll find a block, and that is the guide. It's the short guide. And it's saying to all governments and organizations and universities and NGOs, anybody around the world, firstly, please consider openly sharing all of your works under an open license. This is a Creative Commons license. Support the areas of the UNESCO recommendation and the 5 R's. I'd attract you always to the 5 R's as well because of the retention thing. You do need to be able to retain copies of the works that you use. Then set your default Creative Commons license for your institution. So if you're in a university, you would have a policy that says works that are sponsored by public funds or by donor funds need to be shared under this particular license, and you have a default license. Typically it's a CC BY or CC BY SA. This does not mean that you are working through the midnight hours for you to create it and to share it, unless if that's something that you want to do. This is, if it's sponsored by government, which is our tax money, or it's sponsored by a donor, such as the Hewlett Foundation, and the Hewlett Foundation in particular will say to you, you have to use a CC license, then this will be the one license that you would normally use it under. When you use materials from other people, use this TASL format. It's a title, author, source, and license. So the title would be this slideshow that I'm giving you. The author would be my name. The source would be the link that is on the last slide in this pack. And the license, it would say on the CC BY SA version 4.0. And you normally give a link to the actual license code, so nobody can say they didn't know. Establish institutional policies to say all the above things. establish a process to approve an alternate CC license for a work that where one is needed. So for example, if the default license is CC by SA, and I come along with a procedure that I want to share, but I want an ND clause or I want an NC clause on it, then there should be some process for it. Can I just do it? Do I have to go to a committee to do it? Do I have to register it on a website in the university before I do it? What is that process? It doesn't have to be complicated and it can be quick to do. And then finally, enforce the open licensing and sharing of all public and donor-funded works. That I think I've said a few times already. This is a legal little slide that I'll pop into this sort of thing. Nothing that I say to you is can be construed as legal advice. A lot of what I've popped up here is from the Creative Commons certificate course, so I'm giving attribution to it, and you should be able to register for that course should you want to. I'm just going to switch over to the last slide, and I'll leave this up here for a minute. So Vaynant, I'm going to come to you in just a moment. Across the middle of that, it says slides available at tinyurl.com, and a whole lot geeky thing there. This is the latest version of these slides in a PDF format. Should you want to use the same slides and adapt them for your own use, you can just ask me and I will send the PDF, the PowerPoint to you. I'm quite happy to do that. So that will be in the PDF, and I'll pass this along to Vaynant and colleagues as well so that they can share it. I'm going to drop out of my slide presentation now, and I'm back onto the main screen. So I can see everybody. I haven't looked at any of the chat yet. I don't see any questions in the chat. And I see there are now 54 people online. So welcome to everybody who arrived after the beginning of the presentation. You can, of course, download the slides and you're welcome to contact me. Vaynant?
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to allow the floor to ask any questions. I have one or two comments I would like to make, but I first have to, if there's any questions from anybody, please unmute yourself and ask the question or type in the chat box. Right. While possibly somebody might be typing, I think the one thing that we as librarians need to understand is how do we apply this in our daily activities? And I think that it's critical that we consider how do we present information and what is our role, especially in academic environments where there's a lot of open education resources, but also schools have a number of them. And the one thing you would have noticed, for instance, on the last slide that Paul showed, you would have seen the icon. But what's also critical for us as librarians is that there's two aspects. One is the policies to back up what we do, because we facilitate the knowledge diffusion. So we will have to ensure that our systems, and for those of you who use Figshare, for argument's sake, to distribute research data, there's a built-in Creative Commons license into the system already, but which we use, but we don't have a policy on campus to back it up. So those policies are critical, and also to understand the nuances. Different institutions work differently. At Rhodes, and I think there's another one, I think at UCT potentially, the author or creator always retains copyright. Whereas in certain cases at other institutions, any work undertaken that you paid for actually belongs to the institution. And those nuances need to be considered when we are working with these licenses, and then who's the actual intellectual property right owner. But the one thing I want to share with the librarians is to ensure that it's fine when you share the presentation, it's good to have an icon that explains it and have the license there. But the other thing that we have to consider is also how do we embed this into our metadata when we create bibliographic records for materials. And we have to, at Rhodes at least, we started where we know what we can do. We started to embed the metadata, the actual CC license into one of the fields in the metadata itself, which maybe we should talk to at one stage. There's a couple of questions now, Paul, if you want to respond to them.
Thanks, Vaynant. Let me just first speak to what you've said. What you've just said will cause me to add another slide into the pack. An author automatically has copyright over their own work. So when you're populating that license page, you would firstly say copyright PG West 2020. And after that, it would say, but having said that, I am sharing this with a Creative Commons license. Now, you automatically in this country get the copyright once you have reduced your work to a format that you can share. So my suggestion would be write this thing, call it a blog. You publish the blog. The moment you publish the blog, it is your work. It's only if somebody comes to your computer and steals it off and goes and publishes themselves first that it becomes somebody else's work. You own that work first. If you are under a contract in your institution that says that the institution owns the work, there are still some issues about that, but you're the first owner of that work, even though your institution may lay claim to it after that. So that was just that one, that the author has got copyright on the work. The second thing was, where does this apply to librarians? From my days as a lecturer at the old Technicon SA in Roodepoort, I'm sure you remember it, was that I would go to the librarians and I'd ask them to do a pack. And that was when I first started learning about copyright, because the librarian, fortunately, understood that she had to ask for permission for these things. I didn't know that at that time. You would need to create the pack, noting the licenses of each item that you put into the pack. So if you have 10 different articles, you would put the Creative Commons license for each article in that pack clearly with it, so that if one was an ND and one's an NC and whatever, you would put that very clearly into the pack. You would also have an overall license on the part that you did. And what you did was the cover page, the table of contents, and possibly an introductory note. And that also has a license to it. And you'd have to choose that license. There's some issues about that. You may have to then use the most restrictive license in the whole pack for your piece, but you need to make sure that you outline everything. Looking at the chat window, thank you very much for the kind comments here. The link, I'm just going to click on the link and it's going to go there and tell me certificates.creativecommons.org. This is the certificate course, that is right. So you'd be able to see on the calendar on the right, you'd be able to see when the next course is. I must admit that if you just register for it, it'll cost you $500 US, and it's 2 months of quite hard work to do. There is a scholarship about once a year, and it may drop the price significantly. We did issue some scholarships this year, and so I don't expect to hear of scholarships until next year sometime. So that is the true Creative Commons course. There's another course offered by Wiki Educator. The Wiki Educator is run by Wayne McIntosh in New Zealand. That one is completely free. It's not a CC license, it's not a license course. It is a Wiki Educator course. So if you want to do something free, licensed or registered and certified by Wiki Educator, you can do that as well. So if anybody needs that link, I can find it for you. Then I'm just going to look at the next question here. Why are lecturers reluctant to have their works openly available in the same way as the MIT counterparts? Well, initially MIT didn't like the idea as well. That was the early days of it, but they're very supportive these days. Is the claim that the lecturers that are clinging to traditional copyright linking to institutions, promotion? You're going to come across a whole lot of issues about these things. I've bumped into this in various places. And I've even had arguments about the funding for research. Some of the research I would expect, if you're going to a MasterCard Foundation or a Commonwealth Fund somewhere, you're probably going to find that the funding agency is going to say to you, you have to use this CC license. That's the newer funding. If you are being funded by a big pharma, they're probably going to say that they want full copyright because they want to make millions of dollars on it afterwards. So there are going to be different perspectives on this. A lecturer, for example, I have published an article in the past in a British-run journal, which I don't have the rights to give you copies of. And that really irritates me. I don't want to publish ever again in a journal that says to me that I, as the author, don't have the right to give away copies as I want. And that you would have to go to them and pay $30 or $40 for this. It's an absolute fortune. I refuse to pay for things like that. So it's possible that a lecturer is caught up in that world still. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I would try to give them a presentation on this and try to encourage them to share more openly. Unless
Or if I may.
Yes, Faina.
Sorry, before you get to the next question, can I add something to that?
Please do, go ahead.
What I've noticed, and I'm sure that experiences at institutions as well, is that the institution might agree in principle to certain policies or certain endeavors, for instance, the Berlin Declaration. And Rhodes, for instance, even a signature. But it's not a mandated policy that you can enforce. That is just signing sort of to say, yeah, we have the intention of doing certain things in a certain way. And I like what Paul said in terms of if the funders, and I'm glad the funders have started doing it, the NRF as well, put certain restrictions on not restrictions, but certain requirements on the publication of the data. But we need more of it. But we are fighting on a national level to have the Department of Science and Technology sort of assign a certain policy that's mandated and made enforceable to all institutions, at least tertiary level institutions. And that will ease our process, because I agree with what that said that the lecturers are hesitant. Madiba, I am, the lecturers, and I'm in my experience, and Debbie can also speak to this, I believe the lecturers fear that they're going to lose some rights over it, yet they sign everything away to publishers, which I can't understand. So there's for me a disconnect in terms of what it means. And also what I've also discovered is that lecturers don't often would like to share because they've already plagiarized, or if they've done something else, it's not their own work. So it's sort of, it'll put them in the spotlight in terms of the quality of their work. So there are concerns, and rightfully so, I believe. But it's up to us as librarians, as one of the key role players on campuses and institutions, to actually advocate, consistently advocate for this open science, open scholarship environment. And this is part of it. Sorry, just to add to what we said, Paul.
Thanks, Bernard. I made some notes here. I think it was, is the name Molatoli possibly, about prescribing. If I'm a lecturer and I write a textbook and then I prescribe it to my students, surely I have a very serious ethical problem. You need to think about the ethics of that one. Even if there's a committee that it goes through to allow me to publish and then cause my students to spend money, that's going to land up, a little bit of it will land up in my pocket. There's that to consider in an ethics committee, I think, personal opinion. Then if I was doing that, the amount of money that'll land up in my pocket as opposed to the publisher makes it possibly better for me to just self-publish the book. I know that publishers do provide skilled services, such as the editing and layout and all of those, but there would be other low-cost ways that I can do that as well. I could also talk to a publisher about a different business model. For example, I could say to them, I want to publish this book and I want to use your skills, but I want to share the digital version of this free of charge. You can sell the print version. And I can come up with that business model. I may need to do a bit more work myself, maybe doing the layout and stuff even, but there are alternative business models that I can go into. I also, this has reminded me, there's also the issue of publishing articles in a publication that's called open, but then I have to pay to publish my article. And I've heard some horrific prices of like $3,000 US for me to publish my article in this open journal. I do understand that it costs money to run a journal, but in many cases, institutions run them, universities run them for good reason. So there's a bit of a tension there as well. Personally, I would not spend $3,000 to get my article published in a journal, but then I'm not the academic who's living in the publish or perish world. So that's another issue to think about, possibly with writing up your policy. I'm just looking at the chat to see if I should respond to anything here. Wynand, is there anything more?
Not that I can pick up. Let me see if there's 2 new messages. Yeah, I would like to add that the one thing that as part of the policies, we're working towards where even our thesis submission forms will have the CC licenses embedded, so the student, the scholar will be forced to make a decision, obviously guided by us, but we need the evidence and we need them to choose the license as the creators in order to actually express it in our metadata and on the object itself. But that's one route to go, is to ensure that it's part of your operations, that people understand Creative Commons and how to apply those licenses.
I think it definitely helps if you can build this into the metadata, because as things progress, open learning sites are going to scour your repositories, and they'll be able to pick up on the license and advise another person, you can mix this with this, you can't mix this with this, or how you can mix it together. So it will certainly help to have that. There's one more comment here. Can you please recommend good databases that you would recommend to look for open education resources to use for study material? There are quite a few. I think what we can do is, I think LIASA can distribute this information afterwards. There are a few. I'd certainly point you to, I think Rhodes and UCT have got, and then there's a repository in Europe which I've been pointed to recently. There are quite a few search mechanisms for it. So let's get back to that, Wynand. And Wynand's posted a link on to oercommons.org. That's another good one there. There are quite a lot of these, and I think in time we're going to probably have a meta searcher across all of these things. There used to be some nice search engines that could do that, and possibly that's a project that we can do still. Wynand, I think I've spoken everybody's ears off here.
I think maybe I should just also suggest that there's any more questions, if you'd like to proceed, or if you go home now or go to work and you think about what you've heard, please use the LIASA platform to communicate, and we can all put our heads together, and we can, and I mean, we've got Paul on board as well. We had Tobias Schoenwetter the other day online, which is absolutely brilliant to have him, and other people, Dr. Scott on board. So there's a number of experts in their respective areas that we can apply, at least put questions to have also a comprehensive and cohesive understanding amongst all libraries, so not just have each library again doing everything on its own, running around. So it'll be great if we can share and we can put our heads together. So by all means, email myself or Anna-Marie, and we can collate questions and we put it to the experts out there, and let's have a discussion. But from my side, Paul, there's no more questions, it seems. Thank you so much. I think you're going to have a number of questions coming up, but also a lot of interest from the various people, and hopefully we can have an expert at every institution quite soon represented. I really hope that that'll be the case. But first, callers, please go and visit Creative Commons South African chapter and look at what they're doing and how we can get involved. Paul, thank you so much, and thank you for a great audience as well.
Thank you, Wynand, and I appreciate everybody who joined in to listen to me today. I appreciate that. I know the time's valuable. Wynand, hopefully we can run more of these certificate courses in-house in the country next year. I think there'll be a way to do it on a more cost-effective basis.
I think that's perfect. I think the first port of call is also not to also, as librarians, do it separately from the rest of your entities. Include those people at your entities, like we have to include the learning and support environment staff, so that we can also share and learn together with the other entities that's involved in this process. Paul, thank you so much, and to the audience, thank you so much, and we'll post as much as possible, and look out for the messages. And have a great day.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day and enjoy your weekend. Keep safe.
Thank you.